Have you ever wondered how people manage to fly like this without spending thousands of pounds? Well, the secret often is using points such as Avios. And having made quite a few videos about collecting Avios here on the channel, I'm now realizing that I haven't talked nearly enough about actually using them. And that is why today we're starting to fix this with a new series of content across the YouTube channel and my website. In this video, we are going to talk about 5 different ways to spend a hypothetical stash of 100,000 Avios, starting from some of the not so good options, going all the way up to some of the absolute best ones. And obviously, you don't need to have exactly 100,000 Avios in order to follow along, because it's just a hypothetical round number designed to make our exploration easier. And also, as we go through the video, I'm going to cover some of the important rules behind booking flights using Avios. So if that sounds interesting, then let's dive in. The most basic way to spend Avios is to actually swap them for a cash discount at a fixed rate of 0.5p per Avios. So if we had that imaginary stash of 100,000 Avios, we could exchange them for £500 off a hotel booking or £500 off at Sainsbury's, Argos, eBay, and a handful of other stores. So if you have absolutely no plans to travel, then this would be the easiest way to use your points. Now, there is actually one more way to sort of convert your Avios into cash when you're booking a flight with BA.com. So let's imagine that I'm booking a trip from London to Antalya in early September, and it looks like with BA it's going to cost me around £300. So when I get to the payment page, BA conveniently tells me that I can actually save some cash by part paying with Avios. For example, I could save £67 by sacrificing 16,500 Avios. The problem is, this exchange only represents a value of 0.44p per point, which is lower than the cashback sort of route that we just discussed before, and the lower you go on this list, the worse it actually gets. For example, the option to save £270 by paying 67,000 Avios represents a value of less than 0.4p per point. And if we were to spend our entire imaginary stash of 100,000 Avios at 0.4p per point, that would only yield us £400 of value. So my point is, part paying with Avios only masquerades as a good way to spend Avios, while in reality it's not, and it's honestly kind of bad given how easy it is to access this option, because it's right there when you are about to pay for a flight in cash, and a lot of people are gonna see that. And now let's move on to the actually good stuff, which is booking flights using Avios. So not part paying for them with Avios, but booking actual reward flights. The price of your flight in Avios is going to depend on the distance, so how far you're going, the cabin you're flying in, for example economy or business class, and whether you're flying on a peak date or off-peak date. You also need to pay a small cash component for each Avios flight, and for example on short-haul economy class flights, this can be as low as just £1 round trip. And to illustrate this, let's go back to our same example of traveling from London to Antalya and see if we can book this as a reward flight instead of paying £300 of cash for a ticket. So by default, BA presents us with a price of 27,500 Avios plus £1 for a return trip to Antalya in economy class. However, since we can actually change the Avios to cash ratio that we are going to pay and pick from a few options, option number 4 for short-haul flights is usually representing the best value for Avios, because you are essentially picking to pay a little bit more cash, but on the other side, you are saving quite a lot of Avios. So the sweet spot for this particular flight is going to be 18,500 Avios plus £35 in taxes. And if we compare this to the cash price of the flight, which was £300, it means that we are saving £265 by paying 18,500 Avios, which represents over 1.5p of value per Avios, which is actually exceptional. So if we again had a stash of 100,000 Avios and we managed to spend the entire thing at the rate of 1.5p per Avios, that would yield £1,500 of value, which is like 3 times better than the cashback route that we discussed at the very beginning. And this is actually one of the great things about reward flights. When cash prices are high because, for example, it's vacation season and a lot of people are traveling to Antalya, the Avios prices always stay the same, which opens up possibilities for a lot of savings. But obviously the flip side of all of this is that you may not be able to find availability using Avios because it is severely restricted, so you need to be flexible with your dates. And by the way, if you have been enjoying this video so far, please give it a thumbs up, because it does really help the channel grow. And in the meantime, if we want to take it up a notch, this flight to Antalya, which by the way is over 4.5 hours, would be a lot nicer to do in Club Europe or business class, because you would essentially get priority check-in, priority everything pretty much, lounge access. On board there would be a guaranteed empty seat next to you, as well as a pretty decent meal. And with Avios, that would cost you 35,500 Avios plus £69 in taxes, which obviously is more expensive than economy, but if you consider that cash tickets in business class usually on this route go for over £500, you are still getting exceptional value out of your Avios. And that is actually another great thing I absolutely love about Avios. They can make your travel a lot more comfortable or often actually luxurious without breaking the bank. Another potentially fun redemption in the short haul space is booking business class flights with oneworld airline partners, which also accept Avios. So for example, a lie-flat seat on Finnair's A350 on the route from London to Helsinki will cost you just 18,000 Avios and £60 in taxes. There is also a kind of similar situation with Iberia on their route from London to Madrid, which also sometimes gets the A350 on specific flights. Finally, there is a lot of potential for high-yield redemptions on domestic flights within the US with American Airlines, and actually the whole partner redemption thing is a topic for a future video. And now let's finally talk about probably the most lucrative type of redemptions, which are long-haul business class flights. And if you decide to search for this with BA, you may be a little bit shocked by pricing. For example, an 8-hour flight from London to, say, Boston in business class return with Avios is going to cost you 160,000 Avios plus £375 in taxes. You may have noticed that this price point is way over our imaginary budget of 100,000 Avios, and there are actually a couple of reasons why these flights are so expensive. First of all, when you depart from the UK on a long-haul premium flight, you are charged a pretty large tax, which is called air passenger duty tax, if I remember correctly, which the airline pays on your behalf and obviously prices it into the ticket. And secondly, BA Avios prices on long-haul flights are just generally high. To be fair though, one good thing about BA pricing is that long-haul flights usually include a free domestic connection. That means that a flight from, say, London to Boston in Avios and taxes is going to cost you exactly the same as a flight from Glasgow to London to Boston, so that is very convenient for anyone who doesn't live in London or who doesn't use Heathrow as a starting point of their journey and instead needs to connect from another UK airport. But anyway, here's actually how we can get to the same destination but at a much lower cost. So by avoiding the UK as a starting point, we can avoid the huge taxes, and also we can avoid BA with their slightly greedy pricing. For example, flying from Dublin to a lot of East Coast cities with BA's partner Aer Lingus, which also accept Avios, will only cost you 100,000 Avios plus around £250 in taxes round trip, which is nearly half the price of what BA is asking. And given that these flights for cash from Dublin to, say, New York most often go for over £1,500, you are again getting excellent value of more than 1p per point out of your Avios. You can also use a similar tactic for other destinations. For example, if you're going to the Middle East and places like Abu Dhabi or Dubai, flying with Qatar Airways is going to cost you a lot less Avios and is potentially going to be a lot more fun of an experience than flying with BA. Similarly, you can also consider Finnair for trips to Asia. For example, I very recently took Finnair from London to Hong Kong via Helsinki for just 80,000 Avios, while the same trip with BA would have cost me 100,000. But on the other hand, if you do want to keep things simple and you don't want to, for example, go all the way to Dublin just to start a trip to New York, then you can still stick with BA and use tools like the companion voucher from Amex or the upgrade voucher from Barclaycard to get a 50% discount on the number of Avios you need to pay for a reward flight, which is an exceptional saving and can practically double the value you get out of your Avios. And by the way, in this video here, I review the upgrade voucher from Barclaycard in detail, so consider watching it next. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.